There is a particular kind of pain that comes with being blamed for something you did not do. It is not the pain of being punished for a crime you committed. That pain, at least, comes with the clarity of knowing that justice, however imperfect, is being served. The pain of being falsely accused is different. It is the pain of watching the world reject you based on lies. It is the pain of being transformed from a person into a symbol of dishonesty. It is the pain of understanding that no amount of protestation, no amount of explanation, no amount of evidence of your innocence will ever fully restore the person you were before the accusation. My name is Hannah Pierce. I am 30 years old. 3 years ago, I was accused of embezzling funds from a charity foundation that bears my family's name. 3 years ago, I was portrayed in the media as a hypocrite who preached values that she did not practice. 3 years ago, I became the public face of corruption within the Pierce family, a family that had spent generations carefully cultivating an image of ethical business practices and philanthropic commitment. The accusation destroyed me, not physically, though there were certainly physical manifestations of the psychological destruction, the weight loss, the insomnia, the way my hair began falling out in clumps during the months of investigation and trial. The destruction was primarily psychological and social. The destruction was the collapse of everything I believed about my life, my family, my future, and my place in the world. I grew up with the understanding that the Pierce name meant something. It meant integrity. It meant ethical behavior. It meant a commitment to using wealth and privilege to help people who did not have those advantages. My mother, Margaret Pierce, had instilled this understanding in me from a young age. She had explained that the Pierce family had a responsibility to use its resources and its influence to create positive change in the world. When I turned 27, my mother offered me the opportunity to establish and run the Pierce Family Charitable Foundation. It was an honor. It was a recognition that she trusted me to carry forward the values that the Pierce family claimed to represent. I accepted with genuine enthusiasm and genuine commitment. I spent months designing the foundation structure, identifying worthy causes, establishing systems to ensure that donations would be used effectively and ethically. For 2 years, the foundation operated successfully. We distributed millions of dollars to organizations that were doing important work. We provided scholarships to students from underprivileged backgrounds. We funded medical research. We supported homeless shelters and literacy programs and environmental conservation efforts. I was proud of the work we were doing. I believed that we were genuinely making a difference in people's lives. And then, everything changed. 3 years ago, I discovered that the foundation was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with charitable giving. I discovered that significant portions of the foundation's assets were being diverted to fund public relations campaigns for my family's for-profit businesses. I discovered that donations meant for charitable purposes were being used to finance marketing initiatives and corporate communication strategies. I discovered, in other words, that the Pierce Family Charitable Foundation was not actually a charitable foundation at all. It was a money laundering operation designed to make corporate expenditures tax-deductible. When I discovered this, I did what I believed was the right thing to do. I went to my mother. I went to my sister, Vanessa, who was the CEO of Pierce Holdings at the time. I explained what I had discovered. I asked them to help me understand how this had happened, and how it could be corrected. Their response was to fire me, not just from the foundation, from everything, from my position in the family business, from the family itself, though this was done quietly, without public announcement, without the kind of dramatic confrontation that might have raised questions among the board of directors or the media. And then they accused me of embezzlement. They claimed that I had deliberately misused the foundation's funds for personal benefit. They provided to authorities documentation that appeared to show that I had transferred money to accounts in my own name. They provided testimony suggesting that I had been skimming money from the foundation for years. They transformed me through legal documentation and carefully constructed narrative from a whistleblower into a criminal. The charges against me were dropped after 18 months. The evidence that had initially seemed so damning was revealed to be fabricated. The accounts that appeared to be in my name were actually controlled by someone else. The testimony that had been given against me was discredited, but by that time, the damage was complete. The public had already made up its mind about who I was. The media had already written the story of my guilt. The Pierce family had already positioned me as a cautionary tale about the corruption that can occur when someone has too much access to charitable assets without proper oversight. I left Salem, Oregon, where my family lived and where the Pierce holdings were based. I left Portland, where the trial had taken place. I moved to Boston, Massachusetts, a city where no one knew who I was, where my last name meant nothing, where I could attempt to rebuild my life without the constant reminder of my public humiliation. For 3 years, I lived a quiet, anonymous life in Boston. I worked as a freelance event planner, using my skills to coordinate corporate functions and private celebrations. I changed my appearance significantly. I avoided social media. I did everything I could to exist without drawing attention to myself. I developed the habit of observing people rather than engaging with them. I learned to smile in ways that did not reflect what I was actually feeling. I became very good at wearing masks. The apartment I rented was small and anonymous, located in a part of Boston that was primarily residential, where no one had any reason to know who I was or what I had come from. The apartment had white walls and minimal furniture, and no photographs on any surface. It was designed to be a space where nothing could be traced back to me, where no visitor could understand anything about my life or my past. I kept my distance from neighbors. I kept my distance from friends. I kept my distance from everyone who might eventually discover who I actually was and what had happened to me. The work as an event planner was something I could do competently without requiring anyone to know me deeply. I coordinated logistics. I managed vendors. I ensured that events ran smoothly and professionally. The work required intelligence and attention to detail, but it did not require emotional engagement. It did not require me to share anything about myself. It did not require me to be anything other than competent and reliable. I was very good at being competent and reliable. I was very good at being invisible. But there were moments, usually late at night when I was alone in my apartment, when the mask would slip. There were moments when I would remember what my life had been before the accusation. There were moments when I would allow myself to feel the full weight of the betrayal, the full reality of what my family had done to me. The full knowledge that there was a version of my life that might have happened if my sister and mother had not been willing to destroy me to protect themselves. On those nights, I would pour myself a glass of wine, and I would sit at my window, and I would look out at the city. I would think about the people I had known before the scandal. I would think about the friends who had abandoned me when the news broke. I would think about the colleagues who had distanced themselves from me. I would think about the extended family members who had cut off contact because they could not afford to be associated with someone who was being tried for fraud. I would think about my father, who had died 5 years before the scandal, who had left behind a legacy of ethical business practice and philanthropic commitment. I would think about how much he would have been disappointed by what my mother and sister had done. I would think about how much he would have been disappointed in me for not fighting harder, for not immediately going to authorities, for allowing myself to be accused without mounting a more vigorous defense. But mostly, I would think about the fact that I had no one left. I had no family. I had no close friends. I had no relationships that had survived the scandal intact. I had nothing and no one, and I was living a life designed specifically to ensure that no one would ever know me deeply enough to hurt me the way my family had hurt me. This was the life I had created for myself. This was the existence I had chosen. And then, 3 years after the accusation, I received the invitation to the Halloween Gala, and I understood that I could not spend the rest of my life hiding. I understood that I could not spend the rest of my life accepting the false narrative that my family had constructed. I understood that if I did not return to Salem and confront the truth, I would spend the rest of my existence as a ghost of the person I might have been, moving through the world unseen and unfelt. And then, 3 days ago, I received an invitation to the Pierce family Halloween Gala. The invitation arrived by courier. It was printed on expensive cardstock. It contained a handwritten note from my mother expressing her hope that I would attend the gala, expressing her desire to see me after such a long time apart, expressing what appeared to be a genuine longing for reconciliation. I almost threw the invitation in the trash. I almost decided that nothing good could come from returning to Salem, from confronting my family, from placing myself back in a position where the wounds could be reopened. I almost decided that the healthiest choice would be to continue living my anonymous life in Boston, accepting that my family had chosen reputation over truth, and moving on with the acceptance that I could do nothing to change that choice. But then, I made a decision that would change everything. I made a decision to accept the invitation, not because I wanted to reconcile with my family, not because I wanted to forgive them or to receive their forgiveness, not because I had come to understand their motivations or to accept their choices. I accepted the invitation because I had discovered something that my family did not know I had discovered. I had discovered proof that would expose the truth about what had actually happened to the charity foundation. I had discovered documentation that would prove that I had been falsely accused, and that I had been falsely accused by my own mother and my own sister. I accepted the invitation because I was finally ready to tell the truth. The gala was to be held on Halloween night, 3 years to the day after the accusations had first been made public. The theme of the gala was unmasking ourselves. a concept that my mother had chosen to represent the idea that the Pierce family was committed to transparency and to revealing their true selves to the world. The irony of this theme was not lost on me. My family was going to literally celebrate the idea of removing masks on the same night that I was going to expose the masks they had been wearing for years. I began to plan what I would wear to the gala. I decided that I would come as what I had become: a bride wrapped in ashes, a woman who had been burned by her own family, but who was still standing, still breathing, still capable of speaking the truth, even after years of being silenced. I called Ethan Ward, a journalist who had covered my trial 3 years ago. Ethan had been one of the few members of the media who had suggested in his reporting that my case might not be as clear-cut as the prosecution had portrayed it. Ethan had maintained contact with me over the years, reaching out occasionally to check on me, to tell me that he had continued to investigate the Pierce family's activities, to suggest that there might be evidence that could eventually clear my name. "I need something," I said to him without preamble when he answered his phone. "I need access to video recordings from a Zoom meeting that took place 3 years ago." The meeting was internal, involving my mother, my sister, and several members of the Pierce Holdings board. "That would be impossible," Ethan said. "Pierce Holdings would have destroyed those recordings by now. They would have purged them from all systems. If the recordings still exist, they would only exist in backup systems or in personal archives." "There might be a backup," I said. "Amber Liu was the head of IT at Pierce Holdings 3 years ago. I know that she was concerned about compliance issues and that she maintained independent backups of important communications. I think she might have kept a copy of that Zoom recording." "Why would she do that?" Ethan asked. "Because she has a conscience," I said. "And because my sister fired her for refusing to delete evidence that could incriminate Pierce Holdings." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Even if such a recording exists, accessing it would be legally complicated. It would involve breaking into private cloud storage systems. It would involve theft of proprietary information. It would involve multiple federal crimes." "I know," I said, "but I need you to understand something. That recording contains evidence that I did not commit the crimes I was accused of. That recording contains evidence that my own family fabricated evidence against me to protect their reputation. That recording contains the truth, and I am willing to accept whatever legal consequences might come from accessing it, because telling the truth is more important than protecting myself from legal liability." Ethan did not respond immediately, but after a long pause he said, "I will contact Amber. I will ask her if she still has access to that recording. But I need you to understand that even if I can retrieve it, using it in a public way could result in serious consequences for you." "I understand," I said. "But I have spent 3 years hiding. I have spent 3 years allowing my family to define who I am. I have spent 3 years accepting the narrative that I am a criminal and a fraud. I am ready to stop hiding. I am ready to tell the truth, whatever the consequences might be." When I hung up the phone, I realized that I was shaking, not from fear, though fear was certainly present. I was shaking from the knowledge that I was finally, after 3 years, about to confront my family with the truth about what they had done to me. I was shaking from the realization that I was about to place myself back in a position where I could be hurt, where I could be rejected, where I could be destroyed all over again. But I was also feeling something else. I was feeling a sense of purpose that I had not felt in 3 years. I was feeling the knowledge that I was finally going to do something that mattered, even if that something came with significant personal risk. I began to plan my costume for the gala. I found a wedding dress at a vintage clothing store, a beautiful white gown that had been worn by someone's bride decades ago. I spent hours burning the hem of the dress, creating the appearance of damage, of something that had been through fire but had not been completely consumed. I created a mask that looked like white porcelain, beautiful and elegant on the surface, but cracked and damaged underneath. I was going to appear at the gala as a woman who had been burned by her own family, but who was still standing, still visible, still present. When Ethan called me 3 days later, he told me that Amber had agreed to meet with me. He told me that she had kept a backup of the Zoom recording. He told me that she had been waiting for 3 years for the opportunity to use that recording, to expose the truth about what the Pierce family had done. That was when I knew that I was really going to do this. That was when I knew that the moment of confrontation was finally coming. The evening of the Halloween gala arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes you believe the universe is conspiring to create optimal conditions for significant events. The sky was clear and cold. The stars were visible. There was a feeling in the air that something important was about to happen, though most of the people at the gala would have attributed that feeling to the excitement of a major social event, rather than to the sense that a carefully constructed family lie was about to be dismantled. The gala was held at the Pierce family estate, a sprawling mansion located on the outskirts of Salem that had been in the family for 4 generations. The mansion was impressive in the way that old money creates impressive environments, not through ostentation or excess, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that you belong to a world that most people will never access. The grounds had been decorated for Halloween with elegant touches that suggested sophistication rather than tackiness. Wreaths made of autumn leaves, strings of small lights that resembled fireflies, pumpkins arranged with artistic precision. The main hall of the mansion had been transformed into a space that resembled something between a high-end gallery and a nightclub, though a very refined and tasteful version of a nightclub. There was a string quartet playing jazz in one corner. There were waiters circulating with champagne. There were elaborate floral arrangements and dramatic lighting that created an atmosphere of theatrical elegance. The guest list included prominent members of Portland's business community, members of the Pierce Holdings Board of Directors, major philanthropists, and media figures who would cover the event for various publications and social media platforms. There were approximately 300 people in attendance, all of them dressed in elaborate costumes that suggested they had spent significant money and time on their Halloween attire. I arrived at the gala at 9 o'clock in the evening, the precise moment I had calculated would provide maximum visibility without creating the impression that I was eagerly anticipating the event. I walked through the front entrance wearing my burned bride costume, and I could feel the moment when people recognized me, when the recognition spread through the crowd like a contagion, when the significance of my presence began to dawn on people. I had not been at a Pierce family event in 3 years. I had not been seen in Salem in 3 years. My appearance at the gala was in itself a statement. It was a statement that I was no longer hiding. It was a statement that I had made the decision to confront whatever rejection or hostility might come my way. My mother was the first to see me. She was standing in the center of the main hall, wearing a costume that made her look like a white queen, a regal, authoritative figure dressed entirely in white, suggesting purity and dominion. When she saw me, her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: shock, recognition, something that might have been joy quickly masked by something that might have been fear. She moved toward me through the crowd, and for a moment, I thought she was going to embrace me. For a moment, I thought that maybe, somehow, this event was going to be the moment when my family finally acknowledged what they had done to me and offered some kind of reconciliation or apology. But she didn't embrace me. Instead, she took my hand and she pulled me away from the main crowd toward a private alcove where we can talk without being observed. "Hannah," she said, and her voice was a mixture of emotions that I could not quite parse. "I am so glad you came. I have hoped every day for 3 years that you would come home, that you would understand that what happened was necessary, that it was done to protect the family, that it was not about hurting you, but about preserving what your father built." "What happened," I said quietly, "was that you accused me of crimes I did not commit. What happened was that you allowed me to be tried for embezzlement when you knew that I was innocent. What happened was that you protected your reputation at the expense of my entire life." My mother's expression hardened. She looked like a woman who had prepared herself for confrontation, but who still did not want that confrontation to occur. "That is not fair," she said. "That is not an accurate representation of what happened. Yes, we made difficult choices. Yes, we prioritized the stability of the company. But we did that for everyone. We did that for you as well as for ourselves." "You did not do it for me," I said. "You did it for the Pierce name. You did it because you could not bear the idea that the family might face scrutiny or judgment. You did it because you care more about what people think about us than you care about the truth." My mother opened her mouth as if to respond, but at that moment, my sister Vanessa appeared. Vanessa was dressed as an angel, with white wings and a silver crown, a costume that made her look ethereal and otherworldly. She took one look at me in my burned bride costume, and her face filled with contempt. "I cannot believe you would have the audacity to come here," Vanessa said, her voice sharp with anger. "I cannot believe you would have the audacity to wear that costume, to suggest through your appearance that you are some kind of victim. You are not a victim. You are a woman who broke the trust of her family, and you are a woman who has been appropriately held accountable for that breach of trust." "I broke no trust," I said. "I discovered that you and Mother were using the charity foundation to launder money for corporate purposes. I reported that to you. And you responded by fabricating evidence against me to make it seem like I was the one engaging in fraud." "That is a lie," Vanessa said flatly. "And you know it is a lie. You know that you were engaged in financial impropriety. You know that we did what was necessary to protect the company. What you did," I said, "was commit fraud and then commit perjury to cover up that fraud. What you did was destroy your own sister to protect your reputation. What you did was exchange truth for the appearance of propriety. At that moment, I could see Ethan at the far end of the hall, giving me a subtle signal. The signal meant that the video was ready, that Amber had successfully recovered the Zoom recording, that the evidence was about to be presented to everyone at the gala. I looked at my mother and my sister and I said, "It is 9:30. In exactly 30 minutes, everyone at this gala is going to see video evidence of a conversation between you and the Pierce Holdings board, in which you explicitly discuss framing me for embezzlement. In 30 minutes, everyone is going to know the truth about who you really are and what you are really capable of." The color drained from my mother's face. Vanessa's expression shifted from contempt to confusion to fear. "You would not dare," Vanessa said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "I would," I said. And I have. Over the next 30 minutes, I mingled with guests at the gala. I accepted congratulations from people who had not seen me in years. I smiled and made small talk and played the role of the prodigal daughter who had finally returned to the family fold. But underneath the performance, I was aware of the approach of 9:45, the moment when the truth was going to be revealed to everyone at the gala. At precisely 9:45, the lights in the main hall began to dim. A technician that Ethan had hired began connecting a laptop to the projection system. The string quartet stopped playing. The conversations in the hall began to fade as people realized that something was about to happen, that some kind of presentation was about to begin. My mother and sister realized what was happening. They began to move toward the stage, apparently intending to stop the presentation before it could begin. But at that moment, Harold Bell, the chairman of the Pierce Holdings Board of Directors, appeared and placed himself physically between them and the stage. Harold was a man in his 60s, someone who had worked with the Pierce family for decades, someone who had built his reputation on the principles of ethical business practice and corporate accountability. "I think it would be best if you remained where you are," Harold said to my mother and sister, his voice calm and measured but with an underlying tone of authority that suggested he was not going to accept defiance. The video began to play. The video that appeared on the projection screen was 3 years old, but it was perfectly preserved in the backup files that Amber Liu had maintained. It showed the interior of a conference room at Pierce Holdings. It showed my mother, my sister, and several members of the board of directors sitting around a table, their faces clearly visible, their voices clearly audible through the speakers that had been set up throughout the main hall of the gala. The video began with my mother speaking directly to the camera, explaining her perspective on what needed to happen regarding the charity foundation. "We have a significant problem," my mother said in the video, her tone suggesting someone discussing a business decision rather than discussing the destruction of their daughter. "The foundation's purpose is being questioned. There are regulatory agencies becoming interested in our financial practices. We need to find a way to resolve this situation that protects the company and protects the family." On the video, my sister Vanessa spoke next. "We could redirect the foundation's assets, claim that there was an accounting error, suggest that some of the funds were misallocated due to inadequate oversight. And who would bear responsibility for that oversight error?" one of the board members asked. "Hannah," my mother said without hesitation. Hannah established the foundation. Hannah has been responsible for its day-to-day operations. If we can make it appear that Hannah engaged in fraud, if we can make it appear that she deliberately diverted funds to personal accounts, then the company is protected. We would be accusing our own daughter, another board member said, his tone suggesting moral concern. We would be protecting what this family has built, my mother responded. We would be protecting the reputation that has taken generations to establish. Some sacrifices are necessary to preserve what matters. What about Hannah? The board member asked. What about her reputation? Hannah is young, my mother said. Hannah will recover. The company cannot recover if we allow scrutiny to fall on our financial practices. The company cannot survive if we allow the charity foundation to become a symbol of our corruption. We should fabricate evidence, my sister Vanessa said. We should create documentation that appears to show Hannah's involvement in fraud. We should ensure that when we go to the authorities, we have something concrete that they can use to prosecute her. The video continued for several more minutes, showing the detailed planning of my false accusation. It showed my mother, my sister, and the board members discussing how they would fabricate bank records, create false documentation, construct a narrative that would be internally consistent and externally believable. It showed them planning with the kind of careful deliberation that one might use when planning a business acquisition, the destruction of their own daughter's reputation and freedom. The video ended with my mother saying, "Once Hannah is prosecuted, once she is convicted, once everyone understands that she is the person responsible for the fraud, the company will be protected. The Pierce family will be protected. And we can move forward with the business as usual." When the video ended, there was a complete silence in the main hall of the gala. The 300 guests who had been mingling, celebrating, performing the rituals of high society, were now confronted with undeniable evidence that the family they were honoring was capable of extraordinary betrayal and manipulation. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. And then, all at once, there was chaos. Journalists immediately began recording on their phones. Board members were shouting at one another. Guests were expressing shock and disbelief. The carefully constructed atmosphere of the gala, the sense that this was a space where the important people of Salem's business community could gather to celebrate themselves and their accomplishments, had been shattered by the revelation of the truth. My mother stood completely still. She looked like a woman who had been struck physically, like someone who could not quite process what had happened. My sister, Vanessa, was moving toward the stage, her face filled with rage, apparently intending to physically stop the projection or to deny the authenticity of the video. But before Vanessa could reach the stage, Harold Bell moved to intercept her. Harold looked at the video, looked at my mother and sister, and then looked at the assembled members of the board of directors. "I need to make a statement," Harold said, his voice cutting through the chaos, with the kind of authority that comes from decades of holding positions of power. "This video appears to be authentic. This video appears to contain clear evidence of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud and to frame an innocent person for that fraud. I am suspending Margaret Pierce and Vanessa Pierce from their positions of authority at Pierce Holdings, effective immediately. I am referring all evidence related to this matter to federal law enforcement and to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The chaos intensified. People were trying to leave. People were trying to speak to media representatives. The gala had transformed from a celebration into the scene of a catastrophe. I stood at the periphery of the chaos, watching my family's world collapse. I had imagined for 3 years what this moment would feel like. I had imagined that I would feel triumph, that I would feel vindication, that I would feel satisfied by the knowledge that my family was finally facing consequences for what they had done to me. But what I actually felt was sadness. I felt sadness for the family that I had loved, for the people who had raised me, for the people who had taught me that family and honor and reputation were the most important things in life, and who had then demonstrated that those same values were worth destroying their own daughter to protect. My mother approached me through the chaos. Her white queen costume, which had seemed so regal and powerful at the beginning of the evening, now looked diminished and pathetic. She looked like a woman who had suddenly aged decades, who had been stripped of the mask that she had been wearing for so long that she had probably forgotten what her actual face looked like. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said to me, her voice hollow and broken. "I did what I thought would protect the family." "You destroyed the family," I said quietly. "You destroyed it the moment you decided that protecting your reputation was more important than protecting your daughter. You destroyed it the moment you chose to frame me for crimes that I did not commit. And now, you are experiencing the consequences of those choices." "Hannah," my mother said, and there was a desperate quality to her voice, a sense that she was grasping for something to say that might somehow repair the irreparable damage that had been done. "I am your mother. Can you not find some way to forgive me? Can you not find some way to understand that I made difficult choices in impossible circumstances?" I looked at my mother, and I tried to feel compassion. I tried to understand her perspective. I tried to see her as a complex human being who had made terrible choices for reasons that seemed, to her, to be justified. But what I felt instead was clarity. I felt the clarity that comes from understanding that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. I felt the clarity that comes from understanding that reconciliation requires both parties to be willing to acknowledge the truth about what happened. And my mother was not willing to do that. She was still trying to justify her actions, still trying to frame her choices as something other than what they actually were. "I cannot forgive you," I said to her. "Not because I am unwilling to forgive, but because forgiveness requires acknowledgement of what you did and genuine remorse for having done it. And you are not capable of either of those things. You are still trying to justify your actions. You are still trying to explain why destroying your daughter was necessary, and I cannot forgive someone who will not acknowledge that she has done something that—" The days following the gala were chaos. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to launch investigations into the Pierce Holdings' financial practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission subpoenaed records. Journalists descended on Salem seeking interviews and background information. The Pierce family went from being a symbol of ethical business practice and philanthropic commitment to being a symbol of corporate corruption and familial betrayal. My sister Vanessa was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and perjury. She was released on bail pending trial, but the bail was substantial, and her legal team was advising her to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. The details of her cooperation were sealed, but it became clear through media reporting that she was providing information to authorities about the broader financial practices of Pierce Holdings. My mother refused to cooperate. My mother hired expensive lawyers and prepared to fight every charge that was filed against her. My mother maintained a public posture of injured innocence, suggesting to media representatives that she was the victim of a conspiracy, that her daughter had fabricated the video evidence, that the family was being destroyed by a combination of external enemies and internal disloyalty. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The video was authentic. Amber Liu provided testimony about how she had maintained the backup and why she had kept it. Ethan provided documentation about how he had assisted in accessing the backup. The case against my mother was not a matter of competing narratives or questions about what had actually happened. The case against my mother was clear and straightforward evidence of criminal conspiracy. I received numerous calls from media representatives seeking interviews. I received offers from publishers interested in my story. I received interview requests from talk show hosts and investigative journalists and people who had become fascinated by the drama of the Pierce family's collapse. I declined all of them. I did not want to become the public face of this scandal. I did not want to become famous for being the victim of my family's crimes. I did not want to transform my personal tragedy into a commodity to be bought and sold on the open market of public interest. What I did do was agree to speak with federal prosecutors and SEC investigators. I provided them with detailed information about the charity foundation, about the way it had been used to launder corporate funds, about the conversations I had had with my mother and sister when I discovered what was happening. I provided them with documentation and with my testimony, and I made myself available to appear as a witness in any trials that might result from the investigation. 3 weeks after the gala, I returned to Boston. I returned to my apartment and my job as a freelance event planner. I returned to the anonymous life I had been living for the past 3 years. The only difference was that now I was no longer wearing a mask. Now I was no longer hiding. Now I was no longer pretending to be someone other than who I actually was. 6 months after the gala, my mother was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, wire fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The indictment was based largely on the video evidence that had been presented at the gala, supplemented by documentation and testimony from federal investigators, and from my own testimony about what I knew regarding the charity foundation. My sister agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy and perjury in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and required to pay substantial restitution. By the time of her sentencing, she had already resigned from Pierce Holdings and had been removed from the board of directors. Her future in business was essentially over. My mother refused to plead guilty. My mother insisted on going to trial. My mother's trial lasted for 3 weeks and was covered extensively by media outlets throughout the Pacific Northwest and nationally. I was called to testify as a witness for the prosecution. I sat in the witness stand, and I described in detail what had happened 3 years ago. I described my discovery of the fraud. I described my reporting of the fraud to my mother and sister. I described being accused, investigated, tried, and exonerated. I described, in other words, the destruction of my life by the people who had given me that life. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. My mother was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years. When the verdict was announced, I was sitting in the courtroom. I watched my mother's reaction as the guilty verdicts were read. I watched as the reality of what was happening finally seemed to penetrate the armor of denial that she had been wearing. I watched as a woman who had spent decades maintaining a carefully constructed image of power and control was finally forced to confront the consequences of her actions. And I felt sad. I felt sad for my mother, who had destroyed her own life through her choices. I felt sad for my family, which no longer existed as a family, but only as a collection of individuals separated by betrayal and anger. I felt sad for the people who had worked at Pierce Holdings, who had lost their jobs or had had their careers derailed as a result of the company's criminal behavior being exposed. But I also felt something else. I felt relief. I felt the relief that comes from finally telling the truth after years of silence. I felt the relief that comes from finally allowing the world to know what had actually happened, rather than accepting the false narrative that my family had constructed. I felt the relief that comes from finally being able to stop wearing the mask of false acceptance and to begin the process of genuine healing. After the trial ended, I returned to Boston. I returned to my apartment and my job and my quiet, anonymous life. But something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer living in hiding. I was no longer performing a role. I was no longer protecting my family's reputation at the expense of my own truth. I was finally free. 1 year after my mother's sentencing, I received a letter from prison. The letter was handwritten, written on the small lined paper that is provided to inmates in federal correctional facilities. The letter was from my mother. I held the letter for a long time before opening it. I was not sure I wanted to read it. I was not sure I wanted to know what my mother had to say to me after everything that had happened. I was not sure I wanted to reopen the wounds that had finally begun to heal. But eventually, I opened the letter. My mother wrote, "I have spent the past year in this prison, and I have spent every day trying to understand how I became the person who would destroy her own daughter to protect her reputation. I do not have an answer to that question. I know only that I made choices that I cannot undo and that have consequences I cannot escape. I know that you have every right to hate me, every right to want nothing to do with me, every right to refuse to even acknowledge that we are related. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not asking for your compassion or your understanding. I am simply telling you that I finally understand what I did. I finally understand that I valued reputation more than I valued you. I finally understand that I was willing to sacrifice your future to protect my image, and I finally understand that in doing so, I lost the only thing that was ever worth protecting, the integrity of my own soul." I read the letter multiple times. I tried to feel something, anger or forgiveness or some complex mixture of emotions that might allow me to process what my mother had written. But mostly, I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt a kind of profound sadness that was almost abstract in its nature, a sadness that had nothing to do with whether my mother was remorseful and everything to do with the knowledge that we had destroyed something that could never be repaired. I did not write back to my mother. I did not send her any message or communication. I simply filed away her letter and continued with my life. But that letter forced me to confront a question that I had been avoiding. What did I want my future to look like? I had spent 3 years hiding. I had spent another year fighting for justice. Now, what was I going to do? I decided to change careers. I decided to leave behind event planning and to begin working as a consultant for nonprofit organizations that were seeking to establish robust ethical governance structures and fraud prevention measures. I decided to take the painful knowledge that I had acquired through my family's betrayal and to use that knowledge to help other people prevent similar betrayals from occurring in their own organizations. I moved to San Francisco, a city that was far enough away from Portland and Salem that I could build a new life without the constant reminder of my past, but close enough that I could still be involved in work that mattered to me. I began to rebuild my relationships. I reconnected with Ethan Ward, the journalist who had helped me access the video evidence that had exposed my family's crimes. Ethan and I had stayed in touch after the gala, and our relationship had gradually evolved from professional partnership to genuine friendship. Over time, that friendship evolved into something more complex and more beautiful. I reconnected with people from my life before the scandal. I allowed myself to have relationships that were not defined by my trauma or my need to protect myself or my awareness that I had been betrayed by my family. I allowed myself to simply be a person living her life rather than a symbol of victimhood or vindication. I accepted an invitation to speak at a conference about corporate fraud and accountability. I told my story to an audience of business leaders and nonprofit administrators and government officials. I explained how fraud happens, how it is hidden, how it is eventually exposed. I explained the cost of fraud, not just the financial cost, but the cost in terms of human relationships and personal integrity and the destruction of trust. And I discovered in the process of telling my story that I had something valuable to offer. I had discovered that my experience, as painful as it had given me knowledge and perspective that could help other people protect themselves and their organizations from similar betrayals. 3 years after the gala, I was invited to return to Salem to receive an award from a local nonprofit organization. The award was given to individuals who had worked to promote ethical business practices and accountability. When I received the award, I delivered a speech in which I talked about the difference between reputation and integrity. I said, for most of my life, I believed that reputation and integrity were the same thing. I believed that if you had a good reputation, then you were an ethical person. I learned through my family's betrayal that reputation and integrity are not the same thing. Reputation is what other people believe about you. Integrity is who you actually are. My family had a good reputation, but my family did not have integrity. And when the contradiction between their reputation and their actual behavior became impossible to hide, their reputation collapsed along with their lives. What I have learned is that the only thing worth protecting is integrity. The only thing worth sacrificing for is truth. And the only way to truly be free is to accept that you cannot control what other people believe about you, but you can control what you believe about yourself. That speech was recorded and shared on social media and watched by thousands of people. I received emails from people who thanked me for speaking the truth. I received emails from people who were struggling with similar situations in their own families and who wanted advice about how to confront the people they loved about ethical breaches. I received emails from people who had been victimized by fraud and who wanted to know how they could seek justice, and I responded to as many of those emails as I could. I provided information and support and encouragement to people who were fighting for truth and justice in their own lives. 2 years after receiving that award, my mother was released from prison on parole. She had served 4 years of her 7-year sentence. She was required to wear an electronic monitoring device. She was prohibited from leaving the state of Oregon without permission. She was required to report to her parole officer weekly. She was essentially confined to the margins of society. A woman who had once been powerful and respected, reduced to a status of constant supervision and control. I did not reach out to her. I did not attempt to rebuild our relationship. I did not attempt to forgive her or to be forgiven by her. I simply acknowledged to myself that she was alive and that she was no longer in prison, and I continued with my life. But one evening, I received a phone call from my mother. She asked if she could visit me. She asked if she could see me in person, if she could have a conversation with me that was not mediated by lawyers or investigators or other people. She asked if there was any possibility that we could begin to repair our relationship. I did not say yes immediately. I thought about it for several days. I thought about whether I wanted to see my mother again, whether I wanted to open the possibility of reconciliation, whether I wanted to allow my mother back into my life in any capacity. Eventually, I decided to agree to see her. We met at a coffee shop in Oakland, roughly halfway between where she lived in Oregon and where I lived in San Francisco. My mother had aged dramatically in the years since I had last seen her. She looked like a woman who had experienced genuine suffering, genuine remorse, genuine transformation. But I had learned from my previous experiences with her that appearance can be deceiving, and that a person's exterior does not necessarily reflect their interior reality. We sat at a small table near a window. We ordered coffee. And we talked. My mother said, "I know I have no right to expect your forgiveness. I know I have no right to expect that you will want to have a relationship with me, but I want you to know that I understand what I did. I understand that I chose reputation over my daughter. I understand that I chose to protect my public image at the expense of your freedom and your future. And I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to undo the damage that I caused." I listened to my mother speak, and I tried to determine whether her words were genuine or whether this was simply another performance, another mask that she had decided to wear in order to manipulate me into forgiving her, or to rehabilitate her reputation among people who might eventually matter to her. But ultimately, I decided that the question of whether my mother was genuinely remorseful was not the most important question. The most important question was whether I could have a relationship with her that was honest and healthy, and that did not require me to sacrifice my own integrity or my own truth. I will not pretend to forgive you, I said to my mother. I will not pretend that what happened between us did not happen. I will not pretend that we can simply move past it and return to the way things were before. But I am willing to have a relationship with you based on truth. I am willing to have a relationship with you in which we both acknowledge what happened, in which we both understand the consequences of your choices, and in which we both commit to building something new based on honesty rather than on the performance of family duty. My mother agreed to those terms. We began to meet monthly for coffee or lunch. We began to have conversations about our lives, our work, our beliefs. We did not immediately achieve a relationship that felt comfortable or natural, but we began to build something that felt honest and real. I will not claim that my relationship with my mother has been completely healed. I will not claim that I have achieved complete forgiveness or that the pain of what happened has completely disappeared. But I have achieved something that feels more valuable than either of those things. I have achieved the knowledge that it is possible to have a relationship with someone who has hurt you, provided that both of you are willing to be honest about what happened, and provided that you are willing to allow the relationship to be different from what it was before. I have also achieved the knowledge that I am stronger than I thought I was. I have achieved the knowledge that I can survive betrayal, that I can survive false accusation, that I can survive having my reputation destroyed. I have achieved the knowledge that I can tell the truth even when telling the truth comes with severe consequences. Most importantly, I have achieved the knowledge that the only thing that ever truly mattered was not my reputation, not my family's reputation, not the image that we presented to the world. What truly mattered was the integrity of my own conscience, the knowledge that I had done what was right, the certainty that I had told the truth when telling the truth was difficult and dangerous. I spent 3 years wearing a mask. I spent 3 years hiding who I was and accepting a false narrative about my character. I spent 3 years allowing my family's lies to define my identity. But I am no longer wearing a mask. I am no longer hiding. I am no longer accepting false narratives about myself. I am simply being honest, and that honesty, more than any amount of vindication or revenge or public acknowledgement, has finally set me free.